So I think what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of overview and backstory about how this was made, and then I'd like to hear your questions so that you actually get to find out what you want to know. Am I doing okay on the mic? Everybody can hear?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So what Sandra said about possibility and things happening, originally when I conceived of this idea for this show, we had been in Edinburgh, and at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Edinburgh in Scotland, there's a huge metal scaffolding and in great big lights. It's a sculpture, and the name of the artist is in the catalog, but I can't remember it right now. And it says, "There will be no miracles here." And this is this huge proclamation in lights over this gorgeous green pastoral setting. It's just amazing. And I thought, well, that's a perfect title for this. I thought I would title it "There Will Be Miracles Here." And it turns out that that title was because at some point in Europe hundreds of years ago, there were miracles happening somewhere, and the church came down with a proclamation and posted it at the site, saying, "There will be no miracles here." And so I just think that actually you don't really need anything else in your approach to life except to counter that notion. Right? That's what we get to do. That's our job. So let's see, it was October of, I guess 4 years ago, I was standing in the stairwell of the Missoula Art Museum talking to Brandon Renchis, who's the curator there, and he had just gotten the job a few months beforehand. And we were talking, and he uttered these words, "And if you make art, this is all you dream of, is somebody with power in an institution saying this to you." He said, "If you could do anything you wanted in this museum, what would you do?" And I know, because anytime I walk into a gallery that I like, what would I do in here? So I knew exactly what I wanted to do. So I told him that I'd been making these individual birds, and that they have some kind of resonance and impact that I don't understand. A woman had bought a bird last year, for example, for her sister, who's quite elderly, a red-winged blackbird on a little stand, and the sister who bought it told me that her sister carries it around from room to room in her house with her, because she always wants to be with this bird. So if she goes to the kitchen, she takes the bird. If she goes to the living room, she takes the bird. I don't begin to understand what that is about this object, bird, that has this resonance in the human experience. And something happened in the way I was making them. So 15 years ago or something, I was making tile for my bathroom, and the kiln is round and the tiles were square, and I had empty corners, and because it's my job to save the world by saving the garbage, I couldn't fire the kiln if it wasn't full, so I started making these little birds, and the first 50 of them were hideous. And then they kind of got kind of cool, and then they've evolved. If you've watched this, the first were really tiny and kind of glommy, and they've sort of gotten refined over the years to what you see here. But that was the beginning of the bird thing. I didn't do it on purpose. It was sort of an accident, and it has become this thing that is, it's a vehicle of expression that is way beyond what I understand. So long ago, I just started going with it. Well, people love these. These have meaning. People will tell me stories. I've had people come to me in tears. "I'm so happy you made something I could afford," And people tell me, like, "Oh, before my mother died, all she ever wanted as gifts for the last couple of years were your birds. And when she died, my sisters and I split them up, and they're our most valuable possessions." And so it's clear to me that this is out of my hands in terms of impact, which is, I think for most makers, that's what that's the magic we're looking for, is to make something that's beyond us. And we just get to, okay, I'm doing this, and I don't know, I don't understand what's happening. So what I said to Brandon was, I want to take this notion of bird, like what's iconic about bird, and about these birds, I want to take that and I want to bring it to scale. Fill the room, see what happens. And a lot of my work, my paintings, have been about elemental objects, iconic elemental objects. So stick, stone, bird, feather, things that are in the vernacular of objects that resonate in the human condition as I understand it. So the notion with this show was to do bird and stick, and no more elaborated than what they had to be minimally. So the minimalist notion of bird, the minimalist notion of stick. And as happens, there was a third element that introduced itself and became undeniable, which was shadow. So now we have bird, stick, and shadow. So to me, that's what this show's about. So we set it up at the Missoula Museum, and some of you may have seen it, but that gallery there has a short section that's 14 feet ceilings, and then a little bitty section that's 12-foot ceilings, and most of the gallery is 10-foot ceilings. So it was a very different experience. It was much more sort of enclosed and womb-like and embracing. Anyway, as I was making the Missoula show, it became very, very clear to me that there were things that I wouldn't be able to do in that space for a couple of reasons. One, because of the shape of the space, and then also because when you're making anything, you know, you have, well, I could do this or this, and this or this, and you have to pick one, and then there's 10 other things you didn't do, and I knew that I would want to do this again. So I came to Chris Ricardo here at the Holter, and I said, so in a couple of years, can I bring this show in? And he goes, well, write a proposal. And I sent the proposal, and bless his heart, the day he got it, he called me. And he says, let's do this. And he has been insanely supportive and enthusiastic. For example, I don't know if those of you remember, but the ceiling that was in here was quite old, and it was actually physically falling down. Like pieces of it were landing on the floor on a regular basis. And so I started addressing, well, what do you want to do? Can I do something about this ceiling? And that evolved into my brother, who's an acoustical engineer and builds these panels. We decided he would come out, and we completely rebuilt the ceiling in here. So this is all brand new. My brother Dave is miraculous. And Chip Clausen, where's Chip? Here. Chip. and our friend Ken Herman, who isn't here this morning, but we all killed ourselves 14-hour days for a week and put this ceiling up, and it was amazing. And then Chip also came and killed himself with the installation of this, which took 6 people 4 full days to install this, and this was 6 people who had done it before. So it's a really big deal getting all this stuff moved in and out of here. Anyway, so it's been really great to have this fourth element of the room be so different, because this feels really, really different to me. I have not formed an opinion of if I think it's better one place or the other, but other people have their opinions. I've heard and in the same vein of connections to our institutions and the culture that we live in, many of you might know who Pat Williams is. He was our congressional representative in DC for 18 years, and marvelous, in my opinion, a marvelous congressional representative. And he was the head of the committee that funded the National Endowment for the Arts during the Robert Mapplethorpe controversy about, you know, the crucifix in the cup of pee. And even though the Endowment for the Arts didn't fund that, they had funded the painting of the walls in the museum where that show was. And it was just under siege, and they wanted to shut down the National Endowment for the Arts. And Pat Williams was the head of that committee, and he single-handedly not only saved the National Endowment for the Arts, but he made it bulletproof. It cannot be defunded. They can starve it down, but it can't go away. And he saw that as an opportunity to make this solid. So I ran into Pat in Missoula, and I gave him a catalog from the Missoula show, and he goes, oh. He says, I saw this. He says, where did I see this? He says, I was in this show. And I said, well, it was here at the Missoula Art Museum. He says, you know, I was so lost and immersed in that experience that I could not for the life of you tell me where I was. I could not tell you where I was. And I thought, okay, I can die. I can lay it all down. It's all good. I mean, that was for me, you know, just as a maker, that was just a great. It's like you couldn't have said anything better to me. And Pat Williams, you know, who I idolize, it was really wonderful. But to me, it's really, really important, and I think most people don't understand sort of the relationship between museums and curation and these institutions, and the ability for those of us who make things to realize our notions. It's a big, big deal. And I think particularly when you go to this kind of scale, it just becomes obvious that we can't do it unless, as a whole culture, we support the existence of these spaces. So, anyway, I don't know, I'd actually like to just hear if anybody has any specific questions about things.
I was wondering, I noticed that one of the birds has color on it. Is that the only bird with color? And I was wondering if you could speak to why.
Right. So all the birds I made previous to this show were colored. I had this, you know, the process is you have to make decisions on purpose. Like, okay, what color are these sticks going to be? They come out of the woods a certain color. Do I want to make them? You know, we had talked about, do I want to maybe spray paint them and have all be kind of shiny gray? Do they want to? And the same thing with the colors of the birds. So I decided black, and there was a thought about, would it be matte? Would it be glossy? Would it be whatever? This is what we ended up, you know, this is what I ended up deciding was going to happen here. But I've made red-winged blackbirds. I tend to not want to be entirely species specific, but I couldn't resist. The red-winged blackbirds are just so, I mean, just they work symbolically so well. So I had been making them. When we were putting together the Missoula show, entirely by accident, we were pulling things out of the boxes, and somebody said, well, there's a red-winged blackbird here. So it just got packed by accident, and we decided to include it. And it turns out that the slight variables in species and presentation of these birds become really important for kids. It's an educational vehicle because the kids have, you know, because they don't think they really know how to look at art. So if you give them something to hunt for or something that's, you know, oh, I found this, you know, and it's, so it turned out that even though we didn't do that on purpose, we threw it in the show. We said, well, heck, here, it got here, let's use it. And it turned out to be a huge big deal for kids wanting to see the show to help them look at work. And, you know, theoretically, the more sophisticated extrapolation of that is then, you know, you begin to look for variations and distinctions and meaning and things, but it turns out to be great for kids. So there are 2 red-winged blackbirds in this show. I just put 2 because it's so much bigger. I thought it would be, you know. And there's also a bird right here that was sitting in the kiln, and there were bluebirds above it, and one of the bluebirds dripped onto it, so there's like a blue little sort of feather on the one wing of a bird over here. That also is a little Easter egg that kids hunt for. And then there are 3 corvids in the room. There are 2 here and 1 down at the other end. They're just larger. Like crows, ravens, magpies, those are all corvids. So there are 3 birds in here that aren't the same shape as everything else. And that idea, so, but that's a good question, because the other thing that's different here is those houses didn't exist. And in the other show, actually, so this bench was in the Missoula show, but none of the other benches were in the Missoula show. So I was making, these got built in sections in my shop because I have a 15 by 18 foot space, so I had to build them in sections. So this was the red section, and that was the yellow section. We tagged them all and, you know, took pictures of them and marked the footprint on the map of the gallery on the floor, and, you know, and then reassembled them here. So I was working on the very last section, which was this one. And my son called me and he says, Mom, there has to be a bench in there. People have to be able to sit, and it can't be furniture. You're right. So I made this bench, and then in thinking about this gallery, which is about 40% bigger than the Missoula gallery, and how incredibly difficult it was to reassemble these from the little maps and photos of the previous assembly. What I did for all the other benches, I just made the benches with a minimal amount of trees near them so that they could just be hauled out and in individually. And then I had a big pile of trees, and we just peopled the benches with these copses, of trees on the ends, so that it could be put together on site and it didn't have to be reassembled as it was in the other. So, there's a lot of logistics involved in just figuring out how to make this work physically.
Do you have more that's not in the show?
More. I used every stinking stick that I have. Every stick. I have a piece of grazing ground up in the grasshopper, and for the last couple of years we've been going up there with the truck and trailer and pulling out deadfall and processing it.
Another question I had is, when and how you came up with the idea. Did you come up with that when you were talking to this fellow in Missoula?
Not specifically, although it was probably obvious to me that the sticks would be quaking aspen for a couple of reasons. One, I have a lot of quaking aspen. And number two, I really love, when quakey comes out of the woods, deadfall, if the branches haven't been broken at all, it's this lovely charcoal gray.
So this is all aspen?
Yes, it's all quaking aspen. However, if you break a stick of deadfall quakey, it's bright yellow, which I didn't like. I found that visually. So we went through, scraped all the loose bark off of each tree, grayed out with some stain any place that wasn't a kind of a visually even gray. But the idea of these trees in my head was, once I thought it through, and I can't tell you exactly at what point in the process I decided on precisely the color, precisely, that. But I was pretty sure it was going to be quakies just because I knew I had access to a lot of them.
You had the idea for the whole thing.
Yeah.
And did that come when you were talking to that fellow?
I had probably thought about it, because I wander around thinking about stuff. It's like when I was making illuminated manuscripts of Cubist poetry back in the day, and at some point I made a shift to where I was, instead of doing Gertrude Stein poetry, I decided I was going to do just objects lined up as poems. I was driving to Missoula. This is just kind of my process. Driving to Missoula, and I'm thinking about the concept of words as objects. And then I thought, no, not words as objects, objects as words. And then a whole thing happened. It's really that sort of random.
So it just sort of popped in.
Yeah. So I honestly can't tell you exactly when it occurred to me, like this was an evolved process. But when I knew I wanted stick and bird. I knew that. And I was pretty sure stick would be quaking aspen. After that, it was just a question of sort of parsing.
And it looked a lot different over in Missoula, right?
I think mostly because of the room.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, very, very different. So this, I think of that as sort of dense forest enclosure. This is more meadow and park-like. So the other thing about this room, what occurred to me is I had a lot more opportunity for narrative in this room. In the other room, it was sort of one thing. You go in, it's this dense forest, it's bird and stick, and you get to feel and experience whatever you feel and experience about bird and stick. Here, because we have this long trajectory, I felt like I wanted, when you come in that front, I didn't want you to be boom, like looking at the edge of the forest. And so the houses that are there, those house forms are sort of they're a nod to the rural-urban interface and the human hand on the footprint on the earth. And also to give you a visual screen so that you come to that door and you really kind of have no choice. I mean, I wanted to create a situation where nobody could stand at that door, peek in and go, no, I don't want to see that. Just walk on. But I do that in museums. I do that in museums all the time, particularly if there are bazillions of galleries, right? If there's a lot of galleries and I actually, like if I'm going to the Met in New York, I go, okay, what am I going to, what am I going to see today? I go 20th century decorative arts, and then I have to go like this and walk through Egypt and everything else to get to 20th century decorative arts because, you know, everything else is too attractive. But I also am, you know, my habit is I'll walk through and I'll look into a gallery and go, that's not me. You know, or I do that with commercial galleries too. But I wanted to create a situation where nobody could get away with that here. You know, that because there's this screen and you can't really tell what's happening behind here, you have to come in. You know?
Well, I wonder if that's the case. I wonder if
I don't know if that's successful or not. I'd be interested in hearing, you know. And you know, I actually sometimes, I may get a chance to do this, is kind of just hang out there and just watch people react. With the grief series, for example, I did a series of paintings about grief that were from very personal experience, and it was the whole gallery. We did it at the Sherman Gallery, and it was draped in black. And I was in a different museum with that same show. That went to 11 museums, and I was standing outside the gallery, and it was in a small gallery, and I would watch people go in, and they'd be chat, and then a certain percentage of people would come out of there, and they'd just be wrecked. They'd be sobbing. They'd be, you know, and I thought, oh, well, those people, it's not about me, it's that they have had that experience of grief, and something resonated, right? And then there'd be other people, mostly younger people, who'd walk in, and they'd be chat, and they'd come out, chat, and I thought, oh, bless their hearts, they haven't been there yet. You know, it didn't speak to them. You know, and I'm sure that the same thing would happen here. You know, that there are people for whom this experience resonates and people for whom it doesn't. You know, and I'm just doing my best to cast as broad a net as possible. Because I do care about, I mean, you know, some people make work for different motives, and I care about the conversation and the interaction and the communication. You know, some people are doing it for themselves, some people are doing it for something very specific that's, you know, smaller. I really care about the broad conversation. I honestly can't say that other than sort of stage managing it, that there's not a right or wrong way to react, in my opinion. I just am interested in the reaction. Annie, you had your hand up.
Oh, so I know this is here through December, and then do you have opportunities to go to other galleries?
I probably could muster up opportunities to travel this indefinitely, but I'm not going to.
Okay.
It's, you know, like I said, the grief show went to 11 institutions, but that was easy. You know, it packaged simply, it had instructions, anybody could set it up, you know, anybody could take it down. It was, and this is not that simple.
Well, anybody could once you have done the elaborate instructions.
Yeah, there were very elaborate instructions, but yeah. So, but this is too difficult, and you know, I'm really happy with this manifestation and the previous manifestation. I feel like I've explored this. I feel really good about what's happened with it, and I'm kind of done.
Yeah.
You know, not because I don't love it, and not because I'm not super grateful for this, but because I have a million ideas of other things I want to do, and also I haven't painted for 4 years. And I really, really love to paint, and I really want to paint. Now, the cosmic joke is I might get back in the studio, and what I decide to make isn't paintings. I don't know. You know, and then I might be, well, dang it, I don't get to paint yet. But one of the things that's revelatory about this to me, and actually if I look back on my work for decades, it's obvious, but I didn't figure it out until this, is that I really can't describe myself as a painter or a ceramic artist. I get ideas of something I want to make, and then I do what I have to do to learn to make that thing with whatever it needs to be made of. So when I was doing illuminated manuscripts, I had to learn calligraphy, and I had to learn gold leaf, and I had to learn how to work on skin parchment, and I had, you know, because it's what the idea called for. And because this called for this, then, so for example, I've made probably 5,000 of these birds, and the first 4,000 of them, I made them by hand, each one, just like squishing the clay, you know, sitting and making the birds, which is nuts. And then I was in Portland 4 or 5 years ago for Chris Anneman's show there at the museum, and she has a buddy named Brett Binford who has a business called Mud Shark, and what Brett does, he and his partner, they make plaster molds for slip casting ceramics. And they do it for industry and they also do it for artists. So you have an idea, you want to make multiples, they will make, you send them the original, they'll make you a plaster mold. And in my case, they made me a rubber mold for the plaster so that I could reproduce the plaster molds over and over and over. So I have 20 molds for these birds, 10 left and 10 right. And somebody else can mix the clay and dump it in and pour it out, and then I take each one and form it so that it's shaped a little differently. And then I built the plaster molds for these wall birds and the ones with their wings up. And one of the questions people ask a lot is, well, how many different birds are there? There are 5 different shapes. But because
Total?
of the winged birds, of
Okay.
the flight birds. And they have some of them, so that I make some of them on their belly, some of them on their back, some of them with the wings up, some of them wings down, but there are 5 basic molds for those. David?
Just an observation, you focus on sticks and birds. This harks a little further back, but one of the earliest art museums on the planet, the cave complexes in the south of France. And Lascaux, one of the dominant images there is like what you might call a stick figure with a staff at a specific angle, and on top of the staff is a bird. And I think the consensus is that the bird would represent the soul, the stick would represent the spinal column.
Right, and that goes to this notion that I wanted to explore of an iconic vernacular of objects in the context of the human condition. There are certain things that simply are meaningful as iconographic figures, right? And that was exactly why I felt like I had to peel away all the species specificity or even the color in this case. Think about it. When you're making a decision about this, if these were all blue, this would be a very different experience. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, but it would be very different. And if, for example, this were the thing that I wanted to do forever and ever, I might go, oh, you know what, I'm going to make a forest of all yellow birds or all bluebirds and see what happens. But I'm not as interested in color as I am in objects. So if somebody else wants a forest of yellow birds, you have to make it yourself. Sarah?
So before I knew, of course, about the exhibit, I read a book called Oversport. And when I heard the title of your exhibit, and the book talks about the communication between humans and trees and earth and all things, and just added a whole dimension to what I experienced.
Sarah's Tim's cousin visiting from Pittsburgh, by the way. And you're spot on because we were struggling for a title for this. Because like I said, I'm not a wordsmith, and my original notion for this is that it would be called There Will Be Miracles Here. And Brandon, the curator at the Missoula Museum, said, nobody's going to get the reference. Nobody's been to Edinburgh to that particular museum and that particular sculpture. And Tim read that book.
Oh.
And he came up with this title. And of course, bingo, right? Absolutely spot on, yeah. So that's kind of it's a little bit of, it seems to me that when I talk about this, that's what people are interested in. People are interested in the process. How does this happen? So one of the things I have a friend who was the founder of the Great Harvest Bread Company, Pete Wakeman. And so he's a business person. He's not an art guy. He's a business person. But we had spent, this several years ago, we had spent a weekend looking at art until he and his wife Laura were both just comatose. They were like, please, no more art, enough is enough. And a couple weeks later, Pete says to me, and some of you know Pete, and he's very, he's a thoughty guy. He thinks of stuff. Anyway, he said, so I figured out how the art gets made. And I went, oh, well, do tell. Right? And he says, it's just like business or anything. He says, it's about that verb to be able to. Right? It's can. He says, the only stuff that happens in business or in art or anything is if somebody can. He says, so you have 1 million people out there with skills, you have 1 million people out there with ideas, you have 1 million people out there with resources, you have all of this. He said, but the only things that happen is when somebody puts all that together and they can. For whatever reason, it's just as simple as that. And all that other stuff doesn't get made because nobody can. And so when I had this opportunity, I mean, don't kid yourself, I was thrilled when Brandon suggested that I submit a proposal there. And they get something like 600 unsolicited proposals a year at the Missoula Art Museum. So getting a gig there is not a given, right? And I had the invitation from the curator, but that didn't guarantee anything. I figured I had a 50-50 chance of getting that gig. But I had to ask myself, well, can I do this? Because it's a really expensive proposition to spend 4 years doing something. I had hired help, and there's all the materials, and then there's my time not making any money doing other things. I mean, there's all of that. And so I had to explore, well, can I? You know, so I had to call my retirement investment advisor and say, is there money? Can this be done? And there's all that. So there's the financial end of it, and then there's the, do I have space? Because I actually had to build an extension onto my studio, to have the space to do this. And I had been making clay stuff for 10 years in there without running water, and I realized there's no way to do this without a little bit better setup, and I had to buy a new kiln, and there was all these things to consider about it. And then there's the question of, there are a lot of artists who are a lot better than I am. And am I the person who should be occupying this space and doing this? But I have the opportunity, I have the idea, I have the skill set, I have the wherewithal, and I can. So then the question is, what art gets made? If I can do this and I don't do it, then what gets made? And what as a culture do we all get to have? And so I had to make that leap that said, well, you can do this, so you should do this. But that also goes to your question, Amy, about whether or not I'm going to travel it. I don't want to follow it around for 10 years. I made it. And maybe there's an answer to that where, yes, you can. Like if I had endless amounts of money and I just hired a crew that all they did was move this around, and I showed up and did a talk, then maybe I would, but I can't do that.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll end up at the Outdoor Museum in Lincoln.
But I think it could. I've thought about that. I've been there. There's a wonderful international sculpture park in Lincoln, Montana that has outdoor sculpture, and I thought about that. But I think I'm going to take it apart. I think I'm going to make these benches available for sale. I'm going to make those. I've done those houses as fence sections before, and I've got people who are interested in those as fence sections. So those houses will probably get sold individually as fence sections. The benches will actually, and some of these benches could be fence sections, because the backs could have trees along them, and so there's I'll do something with the parts, because I got to save the world by saving the garbage. I can't throw it away, right? Because that's another one of my jobs. So.